Okay, so I'm going to give a somewhat broad brush view of Neuro and AI. Neuro, of course, being the parent field. And it's been a somewhat contentious relationship over the decades, but I'll go somewhat lightly over that and give you an idea of sort of the broader areas and maybe one or two very specific examples. I think Adish is going to give us some more specific examples of where AI and machine learning apply to problems in neuroscience. Okay, this is not keen on shifting. Okay, don't worry about it. Okay, so this beast is one component, maybe one node of a TPU from Google. And these things consume industrial power stations worth of power, and they occupy gigantic things, gigantic machine rooms. And this thing is in your head. It occupies 1.5 liters. It consumes 20 watts. Okay, its capacity in many respects is still way beyond, and let's not even get into the issues of efficiency. And it certainly does some things, it still does some things a little bit better than AI, some things. Okay, so I'll give a very brief overview of how it does it. And I think the key to it is that the brain operates at many, many levels of physical function, chemical function, and mechanical. Well, all these functions coincide across many scales. And I'll just sort of zoom in from this 20 centimeter, 1.5 liter size thing down towards the some of the machinery that does the computation. So that's the brain as a whole. It's somewhere up at this level. One can take the size of a neuron, which is one cell in this structure, so about 0.5 millimeter. Let's zoom in onto that. So this is a computer model of a neuron, which is a pretty decent model. It's called a Purkinje neuron. This is 500 microns. Now let's zoom in somewhat more and look at a small piece of the computing machinery, the dendrite. And this is a 5 micron cube of neural tissue. In fact, the reconstruction of this is one of the major applications of AI to this field. But let's look at this. The yellow core of this is a dendrite. It is one of the nerve branches. The green thing you're seeing across here is an axon. And imagine this 5 micron cube absolutely jam-packed with these dendrites and axons. It'll probably have 1,000 axons traversing this at different angles. Okay, and the little red dots are, in fact, perhaps, at least to my way of thinking, and maybe to some extent in neural network literature, it's also crucial. Those are the synapses. Those are the connections. And so, but the connections are not simple. And this is one of my favorite illustrations of that. That is a presynaptic boot. It's just the one side of the connection. It's 0.5 micron across. And all the little lovely little twirls and blobs and dots and so on you see are protein molecules. Think of them all, every one of them, as a computational element. Okay, and so we've scaled down from 1.5 liters to 0.5 microns, a cube of 0.5 microns, and it is absolutely jam-packed with computational machinery. And this is how the brain does what it does in such small volumes and with such efficiency. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just give you a very big picture here. 4 main domains in which AI and neuroscience intersect and can certainly learn a lot from each other. Number one is sort of the zero order, the obvious thing to do, which is analyze experimental data, of which there's tons. Simulations, some of the fundamental concepts, and I'll end with a fling at philosophy. That's always a dangerous place to go, but it's kind of fun. Okay, so experimental data. So this is just a very short list of the kinds of things that one does with experimental data in neuroscience. For example, I think Adi uses it, many people use something called deep lab cut, which is basically you train a neural network to look at an animal running around. You identify salient points like the nose of the rat or its tail, and then the neural network can look at a movie and say, this is the exact coordinates of the animal in time. Okay, so that's just one very simple example. Many people use it. There's the classification of activity. Nowadays, one can record from 100,000 neurons at the same time in a living, running around organism. How do you make sense of it? And one of the many ways in which we make sense of it is to actually ask a neural network, can you figure out what the animal was doing or what it was remembering or something like that? So this is another kind of thing that one does with AI. Connectomics, the problem of figuring out those 10 to the 14 or so connections in the brain through serial EM section is a hugely nasty one. And it's one which has greatly been accelerated in recent years through the use of AI techniques. Looking at neural coding, figuring out what the neural activity means in terms of what information is represented in there. And I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about multimodal data, which is something that we actually have as both a problem and an opportunity in the system at NCBS through a collaboration with NIMHANS and INSTEM. And hopefully we'll be able to take some of these approaches and possibilities further with a pan-TIFR Neuro Center that is in the very, very nascent stages, but we hope that it will be a source of interesting challenges. Okay, so let me talk about ADBS, Accelerator Discovery Program for Brain Science. I think there's a few more qualifiers in there, but that's a good place to get started. So it's a really quite an extraordinary data set or collection of data sets. So as I said, it combines three major institutions. NIMHANS is the major neuro hospital here in Bangalore. It covers all of South India. NCBS and INSTEM is our neighbor on campus. Raghu is the coordinator of this at NCBS. They're, of course, coordinators at each institute. And I'm helping with the informatics of it. It's a fantastic data set. We have families with different neurological conditions, generations of them. So we have a huge amount of interesting genetic linkages in stuff there. They've done clinical, they've done neuropsychiatric, they've done functional infrared, they've done EEG, they've done MRI, they've done eye tracking, they've done genomics, proteomics. They have all of these data sets from these patients. You can take the blood we have taken blood from these patients, converted them into iPSC lines. We have cell lines from these. We can now express them and make neurons out of those. And now look at the physiology. So this is an absolutely staggering data set in terms of potential. And we're just getting to the point of putting it together. Just to put numbers in perspective, I know astronomy is notorious for astronomical numbers. We won't go there. But these are also reasonably big numbers, right? We have, out of 30 patients, we have 50 terabytes or so. For MRI, we have a few hundred patients. We're dealing with 40 terabytes. We're planning 1,500 patients and are going to follow them over 20 years. Yeah, but it's marvelously multimodal. And this is going to be a lot of fun to analyze. Okay, simulations. Actually, Shravan, you were saying something about speeding up your simulations. We can actually start to do the same with neuronal simulations. And I thought this was actually, I thought it was really funny when it happened, right? We're using a neural network to speed up a simulation of a neural network. This is completely bonkers, but anyway, it's nice. Okay, there's other problems in doing simulations, but suffice it to say that there's lots of applications here for neural network stuff. There's a lot of interplay of concepts, and I think this is this to me is the most interesting part of what one can do in this field. So for example, neural networks, obviously we're inspired by looking at real neural networks. The whole idea of attractor networks has been hugely important in driving the ideas in the field. And it's sort of come full circle. We can now use some of the principles that Hopfield and others talked about a long time ago and apply them to known brain circuits. Here's another oldish example. This is the depression versus concave versus convex problem. And you can look at it and see it. So many years ago, Terry Sosnowski made a neural network that does this. And the reason I'm telling you this is that this neural network, he did something, again, like what Shravan said. He said, what is the neural network doing inside it? Can we extract some principles from what the neural network internally is doing? And what he found was that even though the network was trained on this problem, it yielded patterns of activity similar to what we see in our brains, which are trained on much, much more diverse kinds of problems. So the interpretation of this kind of orientation, selectivity, and so on may be just that these are side effects of a neural network doing the kinds of computations it's really supposed to do, like figuring out shape from shading. And this is something I'm very interested in. What are the computational benefits? Can we tell AI something by using time delays, which are usually thought of as an impediment to computation, at least in the digital computer sense? Can we use those time delays as part of the computation? Because the brain does that. Okay, I'm nearly done. So this part is hand waving and fun, but I think this is actually also maybe, to me, a core part of what we want to do. First of all, for all these centuries, millennia, whatever, ever since we started to ask, who am I and what am I doing here? There's been only one existence proof that from matter, you can get something like mind and intelligence. I won't even say the C word. It's a dirty word in neuroscience. Yeah. Okay. But you can get these things from matter. And that's been the one existence proof, is been in our heads. And now we're starting to get to the point where we have another existence proof. Our AI systems, we're starting to get things which can do some of these operations. Yeah, they can translate for you, they can predict protein structures. And the weird thing is that in both these systems, we don't know what the hell is going on. Yeah, we'd love to know. And I think that being able to understand what's going on to allow these networks to come up with these computations is, I think there's some fundamental isomorphisms there. I think that somewhere deep down, the way in which both the brain and neural networks encode the statistics of the world and then use them to extract hypotheses and generate ideas, I think this is a very, very important core similarity between these fields. And I think a lot has to be learned from that. Okay. So as I said, there are 4 key areas. I think all of these are ripe for fascinating collaborations. And yeah, we'd love to talk about it. Okay, and that still is a little bit ahead of your big fat machines. Okay, thanks. There's a mic up there, just next to Sandeep.
Okay, so this might be a very naive question coming from an astronomer, but are there ways where you can use real natural brains to simulate artificial intelligence? Can we train a natural brain, a set of neurons in a lab?
Well, that's what you do all the time, right? When you sit back and go to a chalkboard, and that's what you're doing. Huh? Yeah, you can do it. It's more of a very contorted way of doing it. It's a very hard way to do something which is much better done by entering it on a computer or just thinking about it. Yeah, you can do it, though. Yeah, I mean, neurons are complicated. They can do these things. They're much more, real neurons are much more capable beasts, as I hope I conveyed, than your point neurons, which just do a information transfer function. Yes, Sandeep.
Yeah, I have a question on, can you hear me?
Shravan is the boss.
Since you mentioned Hopfield, you and I back in the early days were together when he was doing this great stuff. Neural networks had that kind of initial, enthusiastic phase. Then they died, and then they resurfaced.
Yes.
And when I ask in layman terms, various people, they say we added more layers, and they started doing fantastic things. And as you indicated, perhaps, why did they start? Is there any understanding of why the extra layers started doing all these fantastic things that they couldn't do with
No, so Sandeep, I think that comes to exactly the point I'm making. I think that this is where the sort of the more powerful mappings between the brain and the neural networks started to kick in. Once we are able to go through the many layers, and the brain has zillions of layers. Once you have the compute power and the data sets to train networks, they're still using backprop, man. That's archaic, but they're still using that to train these. But now that you have the layers and the training capacity, it turns out that it does things like it can track your every move in real time if you are in a police state, which let's hope we don't get too far in that direction, and can do so many other good things as well, not just. So I think that has been the big transition, that we've got the capacity to do these things, and then it's throwing out the kinds of capacities that we take for granted in our own heads.
So from a cognitive science, neuroscience perspective, one thing that would be useful for machine learning that certainly I think we still don't know how to do very well and we would like to do is imitation learning. So like basically you try to imitate your elders, you try to imitate a master and apprentice relationship, a person tries to do something and then you try to imitate and so on. It seems like humans have an extraordinary ability to generalize. Like for example, if I teach you how to lift a plate of size 5 centimeter in diameter, you would lift a plate of size 10 centimeter in diameter. Of course, I mean, you must have reasonable ability, but yeah, potentially you can. But even such things are a bit hard for robots to do. And I think just neural nets alone is not quite the answer to those kinds of questions, or at least we do not know how to train them well, and maybe there is some other thing lurking.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're getting there. I mean, my way of looking at it is that this is actually an opportunity for us as both neuroscientists and as people studying AI to understand what it takes to be able to generalize. I mean, artificial general intelligence is, one of the holy grails, right? How do you generalize the way that humans do so effortlessly? I think that there's a lot of very interesting work happening in that domain. And I think that the insights from that are useful to neuroscience as well as to the artificial intelligence community. But yeah, absolutely. Yep.